Five Nights at Freddy's is a game without a story. Let me rephrase that. Five Nights at Freddy's is a game in which the story is buried in cryptic messages, mini-games, and ultra-high contrast JPEGs. Put simply, the story is really hard to find. Just search on YouTube and you will find dozens, if not hundreds, of multi-hour-long series explaining the FNAF timeline. And they are all a little, or a lot, different. On the surface, the premise is simple. Chuck E. Cheese-style animatronics are haunted by the souls of dead children, murdered in cold blood, and their bodies never found. The games have you take on the role of a night security guard fighting for your life to keep these monsters at bay. But behind all of that, hidden in the details, is the deeper and far more terrifying story. So, like many YouTubers before me, I've decided to create this video series to try and explain the FNAF lore to those who might not have given it a look. I hope that I can provide an accurate portrayal of the major events of the series, while also providing some added context to explain the gaps that exist. See, there are certain details that you just cannot leave out, and there are some that, if they're completely ignored, can cause confusion. But there's also a lot of contradictory information between the books and the games and mini-games, the glitches and cryptic messages, and a game developer likes to interact with the community and send them onto deep spirals by just mentioning an animatronic's beak! Or lack thereof. In this world of horror that we call FNAF, there are very few concrete pieces of information. We know the main characters of the game, though their names are up for debate. We know vaguely of some events. The missing children's incident is one, the birth of Springtrap another, though the details and place and time can come into question. We know that some animatronics are haunted and some aren't, but which ones and by whom can cause many FNAF fans to butt heads. Hence, all of the different timelines. My main reason for making this timeline is I want to give a hopefully entertaining video that can bring more people into the wonderful FNAF world and the theory community. Another reason is that most theory videos on YouTube predate the newest game content, Security Breach Ruin, which may have huge implications for the previous games. So this will be a much more up-to-date timeline than many of those. The other is that I see many people's interpretations seek to look at data and only data, trying to piece together the timeline simply based on the objective facts. I do appreciate this. It has provided a great structure to build this timeline on top of. But what it leaves out are those details, the motivations of the characters, the things that drive the story forward. See, I think by exploring the motivations of these characters, we can come to a better understanding of the why behind the what, and with that, perhaps a more detailed picture. So, like many a theorist before me, I'm going to seek out to put together a version of this story that will not only educate you on the broad strokes of the FNAF lore, but also hopefully add some more ideas to ponder within the community, and make it a more interesting tale. I intend for this to be a multi-episode series, probably somewhere between 3 to 5. Basically, the FNAF lore is so deep and there's so much to it to figure out that it's going to take multiple hours to get through all of this content. So as a result, just to save my own sanity, I'm going to be releasing this in pieces. But once it's done, I'll release the full timeline as its own video. Alright, I know I've spent some time on this ground-laying preamble, so let's just go ahead and get into this thing, shall we? So without further ado, let's take a look at the tale of Five Nights at Freddy's. We begin with Fredbear's Family Diner, a cozy place where a family could get a good meal for a great price and be treated to a show. The animatronic duo of Fredbear and Spring Bonnie were the main attraction for the kids. The Fazbear characters were incredibly popular, with successful TV shows and merchandise lines. Fredbear and Spring Bonnie were far more than just restaurant attractions. Just across the town of Hurricane, Utah was another restaurant known as Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. It was a lot larger, with a full entertainment center, and featured the modern Fazbear characters of Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy. The same characters that were on TV. Fredbear and Spring Bonnie, they were the classics. But what Fredbear's had that was unique to the diner were the spring-lock animatronic suits. A mechanism could be twisted to open up the spring lock parts, pressing them against the walls of the suit. This would allow an employee to step into the suit and walk around, dancing and laughing with the children. They could then take the suit backstage, step out of it, and return it to animatronic mode. They could then send it out on stage to give a pre-programmed performance. This level of interaction truly made Fredbear's a special place to visit. The restaurant, originally belonging to William, had once closed down, but after an investment from Henry and subsequent partnership, they were able to revitalize it and create something even greater. Now, in the early 1980s, Fazbear Entertainment was on a meteoric rise. The Afton and Emily families were very close. William, with his wife Clara and 3 children, Michael, Evan, and Elizabeth, and Henry, with his daughter Charlie. Sadly, Henry's wife Alice passed away shortly after Charlie's birth. Henry was fortunate to have the Afton family to lean on to help him raise Charlie. Clara and William had a tumultuous relationship, and at this time they were separated, with her having custody of Elizabeth while William had custody of the boys. We'll talk more about these details later because I added a lot in there, but for now, just go with me. Over the years, what was left of the Afton and Emily families would spend a lot of their days at the restaurants. As running the multiple businesses was so time-consuming, William and Henry could barely be away. And with Clara and Alice both gone, Henry and William were without help caring for their children. William would begin setting up surveillance systems to allow himself to watch his children while he worked in his lab. He set up cameras all throughout the home and outside. He built a special Fredbear plush for Evan that had a hidden camera and radio so William could hear what Evan heard. He could even speak to Evan through the radio, if he had wanted. Most days, Michael would be tasked with babysitting Evan, though he mostly ignored him. Sometimes Evan would go into Elizabeth's old room and play with her toys. This made him feel a little better. Many weekends would find the boys at the restaurant while William worked. Being neglected and left to their own devices, Evan would wander around the restaurant playing with the games, watching the show, and drawing pictures. Michael, being much older, was always resentful of having to go to the restaurant, and he hated having to watch after his brother. Occasionally, he would even prank Evan, jumping around a corner wearing a foxy mask and sending him running and screaming. One day, Evan wandered into the back of the restaurant where the animatronics were stored. His father would probably be working back there, he thought. However, Evan saw something that terrified him. Not knowing how the spring-lock suits worked, Evan looked on in horror as he watched one of the employees seemingly swallowed by the stomach of the animatronic. Then, as the mask was placed on the employee's head, he could only see the jaws clamping down on them. While the employee was in actuality perfectly fine, Evan's imagination got the better of him, and he ran back into the restaurant and hid beneath the table, crying profusely. He would eventually fall asleep under the table. However, sleep would not be an escape for Evan. From then on, he would have frequent nightmares of the animatronic characters he had once loved, reimagined into horrific monsters. He would dream he was in his bed, but unable to move. Down the hallway, he could hear as they slowly marched towards his room. They were nightmarish versions of the characters he had loved. They had giant fangs and sharp claws. Their eyes were menacing and they had mouths for stomachs, reminding him of the employee he saw devoured by the suit at the restaurant. These nightmares are what I believe to be the events of Five Nights at Freddy's 4. There is some debate within the community as to whether or not these animatronics are real, are hallucinations, or literally nightmares. Within the books, there are devices that are explained to be able to play high-pitched sound that essentially alters what people see. While these discs are believed by some to be in the games, and there's a little bit of evidence for that, they're not explained as having these hallucinatory abilities, at least not to the degree to create the nightmares as hallucinations. But for me, I think the simplest answer is the best one, and is evidenced within one of the minigames. Evan sees something in the back room that appears to be someone being put into a suit, and this scares him because to him, it looks like they're being eaten. In a teaser image for FNAF World, the text reads, "What is seen in shadows is easily misunderstood in the mind of a child." To me, this suggests that they could simply be nightmares. Plus, I just don't really like the hallucinatory disc idea. It's a totally valid view to have, but for me, it just feels a little bit unnecessary. It feels a little bit extra, and it feels like a deus ex machina. So essentially, anytime your lore seems weird, or your timeline doesn't fit, or whatever, you can always just throw in hallucinatory disc, and then suddenly you've fixed it and pushed it to the side. That just doesn't work for me. But that's a preference. If it works for you, it works for you. Anyway, let's get back to story. In 1983, Evan Afton would have a private birthday party at Fredbear's family diner. His family and the Emilys were all in attendance, as well as many of their friends. Michael, in particular, had brought 4 of his friends with him: Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, and Fritz. While Evan was turning 7, his older brother and friends were all around 11 or 12. They thus felt they were too old to be at a children's party, but had to go nonetheless. Real quick, those names are not necessarily the kids' names. It's one theory, and those names will be very important later on. So, in my theory, these kids have those names, but that's not necessarily the case. Evan was still very sheepish around the animatronics. While he would put on a strong face so as not to incur the wrath of his father, he was still anxious whenever near them. He recoiled as the mascots walked throughout the party, hiding under the table once again. Eventually, the mascots went back up on stage, their performers having left the suits. Michael and his friends found Evan underneath the table. And spurred on by his friends, Michael cruelly grabbed him, lifting him to his feet and heading to the stage. Evan cried as his brother carried him towards the animatronics, holding Evan right up to Fredbear. "Someone want to give Fredbear a kiss?" he would say. No one else at the restaurant seemed to notice as Michael approached the stage with his brother. The animatronic danced and jerked around as Michael slowly put his brother's head in between the jaws of Fredbear. Evan screamed as Michael and his friends laughed at the crying child. The animatronic jaw snapped shut, the spring locks giving way due to the boy's thrashing and his tears wetting the sensitive mechanics. Michael and his friends stopped laughing. They stared in horror as the blood started dripping from Fredbear's mouth, and as Evan's body went limp. Michael couldn't remember who screamed first, but his father shortly came bolting into the room, a crowbar in his hand. He pried the jaw open and rushed Evan to the hospital. Michael stood there. What had he done? Evan was given emergency surgery. William was in a rage and began yelling at everyone, nurses, security, doctors, anyone he could. He lashed out and attacked one of the nurses for pushing him out of the hallway, and ultimately security had to be brought in to restrain him. By the time the police arrived, William had fled. Unable to be in the hospital, William went back to the restaurant, the chaos of the decorations strewn about as parents had quickly rushed their children away. He walked up to the Fredbear animatronic, staring into its lifeless eyes, mostly black, but with a bit of silver reflecting off of the endoskeleton within. He yanked free the crowbar from his gaping jaw and began smashing the animatronic violently, knocking it to the floor, tearing apart its joints and rendering it a useless pile of scrap. William eventually stopped, his anger temporarily satiated, his body exhausted. He was only left with his grief, feeling it in the way that he did. He got to his knees to look at the battered bear that had nearly ended his son's life. The thing twitched as it lay on the floor, red stains running down its mouth and body. Even William would have to admit, it almost appeared like it was dying. After the accident at Fredbear's, Evan would fall into a coma, one that would last several months. William brought him to live at home with him, and Claire and Elizabeth returned home so they could be with Evan. Michael and Clara would cry together, but William, he was numb to the rest of the family. William would work in his basement all day, constantly monitoring Evan. He wouldn't let his child die. He would do whatever it took. He would speak to Evan through the Fredbear plush and say, "You will be okay. I promise. I will put you back together." William would begin researching anatomy and physiology, biomechanics, computer science, the occult, anything he could do to find a way to heal Evan. How could he though? The damage was too severe. How could he take Evan out of his broken body and bring him back? William worked tirelessly, harder than he had ever worked on anything, but he wouldn't be able to find his solution before the worst happened. Evan passed away. William's heart was broken, and where once sadness could reside, only rage remained. Okay, let's sum things up a little bit and then maybe justify a few of the things that I talked about. We have a neglectful, paranoid father whose child dies at the hands of a thing he created and a child that he ignored. This moment is one of a handful throughout the series that drastically change William's behavior. From here, the seeds of a sinister nature will begin to form. So one important choice that I made here, and this is a debate among the community, is the names of Michael's friends. You see, throughout the lore, we have this set of names that are very important, which I won't get into until next episode. And then we have these children that we know are friends with Michael. Now, combining those two things together gives not only a lot of flesh to understand those names and who they are, but also gives motivations for William to do what's coming next. Another hot debate within the FNAF community is eye color. So here I picked silver for Fredbear because the book is called Silver Eyes. And so to me, it's like, all right, that pairs up just fine. But there's a lot of people who think that the eyes should be red, and I'm fine with that too. Whatever the eye color in this situation, to me, it doesn't really matter at this point. Later on, eye color is gonna matter for a specific character, but here, I think either one is fine. So if you like red eyes, it's red eyes. Don't matter to me. But now, let's take a step back in time and learn a bit about how we got here. See, I wanted to start near the bite of 83 because that is probably the most important inciting moment of the entire series for William. It's also the part of the story I did the least to modify the timeline, and that is in part because this is one of the most studied moments throughout the series. In contrast, the next section had many, many holes to fill, and so I had to do much to build that story on my own, as well as taking pieces from other theories online. After we go through this history of Fazbear Entertainment, I'll clarify all of the significant changes and inferences that I make. And with that, let's go ahead and get on to the next chapter, a history of Fazbear Entertainment. Fred's Roadside Diner and Sing and Bear Show, the home of Fred the Dancing Bear, known locally as Fredbear. William Afton grew up in this restaurant. His father, a former circus performer and owner of the eponymous bear, opened the restaurant in the 1940s, a staple of Hurricane, Utah's local culture. Families could get a cheap meal and be entertained by Fredbear, a bear that had been trained to dance and to even move its mouth as if he was singing along to the music. Fredbear had been a big attraction in the latter days of the circus, so when the circus disbanded, William's father set up his own little show that grew into their family restaurant. William was born in the 1950s, and at that time, Fred was still around. But by the mid-1960s, the bear had sadly passed away. William's father was distraught. Fred had been like a son to him. But William, now in his teens, had an idea. He always loved Halloween and being able to step into the shoes of a fun character, so he took the initiative and created a bear mascot costume, fashioned after the lovable Fredbear, a golden bear with a black top hat and bow tie. The patrons loved it, and William's father would dance and sing alongside the children and had a wonderful time. The character of Fredbear was a resounding success, and not too long after that, William would join his father on stage as the mischievous Spring Bonnie. The two would pantomime conflicts, William would hide throughout the restaurant, and Fredbear would call on the children to find the silly bunny. Once a child found William, he would jump up on stage and join his father for a song. William truly loved playing Spring Bonnie. He felt like he could show a whole different part of himself when hidden behind the mask. He felt more free. This act would go on for a few more years, but William's parents would suddenly pass away, leaving him the restaurant and an empty heart. William would continue to operate the restaurant for a short time thereafter, but without the business acumen of his father and no one else reliable enough to stick around for more than a few months, he would have to make a hard decision. In 1970, William had to close down the restaurant. While he wouldn't sell it, he couldn't keep up the operating costs. He wouldn't abandon his history, his legacy. He would find a way to put it back together. Now, there were other restaurants in the area with a similar family-oriented atmosphere. Fredbear's may have been the first, but there were many restaurants that had sprung up since then that had left Fredbear's in the past. William was determined to figure out what they were doing that he could possibly use to revitalize Fredbear's. As luck would have it, one such restaurant was hiring for the position of security guard. It wasn't what William would have liked to be doing, but it would afford him a modest income and plenty of time to study the competition. Thus, he applied for the position, was hired, and went to the restaurant for his training. Chica's Party World was quite the spectacle. A restaurant and amusement center rolled into one. Where Fred's family diner had an entertainer to keep the families engaged and happy, Chica's was filled with coin-op games, pinball, and even some of the new electronic video games that had been making a stir. Truly cutting edge. Or at least that was, until William turned his attention to the stages. There was one main stage in the center occupied by 4 characters, while a similar stage sat off to the side. The characters moved along to the music, however, they would jerk wildly and harshly in any given direction, devoid of any lifelike movements. These were clearly machines. However, with recorded voice lines and back and forth banter, there was an air of comedy to the entire affair, and the audience clearly enjoyed it. As you listened, you would learn all about the different characters. Chica the chicken, who loved to eat, the whimsical magician Orville the elephant, the surprisingly introspective Pig Patch, the adorable, cheerful Happy Frog, the talkative Mr. Hippo, and Ned Bear, the... Wait. Ned Bear? A talking bear with a top hat and a tie? Often the butt of jokes, treated as out of touch? This hurt William. This made him upset. This made him angry. As he sat there seething, William was greeted by the man who would be giving him his orientation, one by the name of Henry Emily. Henry seemed to be roughly the same age as William, with a full beard but a childish gleam in his eyes. Henry had all manner of tools hanging from a utility belt he kept around his waist, dressed in overalls with grease all over his hands and clothes. He wiped one of his hands cleanish and outstretched it to William. Henry introduced himself as the animatronic technician. It was his job to maintain the animatronic performers. William interrogated him briefly and learned that these were not his characters, but that he merely built them for the company. Henry was not entirely to blame for William's insulted ego, so the two carried on a friendly conversation. Henry showed William around the restaurant, explaining the different rooms and common places where children would hide. It seemed most of William's job as security guard would be wrangling children who wandered off. It wasn't long before Henry learned about William's connection to Fredbear's, and as soon as he did, Henry began gushing over the character. He spoke about how when he was a child, he visited the restaurant and it had made him fall in love with the magic of Fredbear, and as he grew, the goal to create a fantastical place like that himself. A puppeteer by passion, Henry saw the animatronics as a newer form of the time-honored tradition. For now, he would need to get some experience under his belt, and thus, he found himself at Chica's. Henry handed William his purple uniform, and just like that, William became the new security guard at Chica's Party World. As their friendship grew, it didn't take long for the two of them to decide that as soon as possible, they would reopen Fredbear's and bring it into the modern age. Even beyond that. Over the next year, Henry would begin raising funds while also teaching William about the animatronics and their functions. He was going to need another animatronic technician, and William was eager to build the next generation of Fredbears. Over the coming years, they would continue to build their business plan, and they would also both build their families. The same year William met Henry, he also met Clara, his future wife. The two had a passionate romance, but one full of conflict. They would fight and separate and then get back together. In the early 70s, during one such separation, Henry would console Clara. This made William paranoid and jealous. He quickly apologized and he and Clara reconciled after a few weeks. However, when he found out she was pregnant with their first child a few weeks later, his paranoia came back in full swing. This was Henry's child. He was sure of it. He would argue and fight with Clara over this, claiming the child was not his. He would go on to help raise Michael, but never truly saw him as his own child, despite the clear resemblance. Henry would also meet his wife, Alice. They had a picture-perfect relationship, something William was quite envious of. Sadly, however, in 1977, when their child Charlotte was born, Alice passed away due to complications in childbirth. This sent Henry into a spiral of sadness and depression. Henry leaned on the Afton family, just as he had been a shoulder to cry on for Clara and William in the past. Clara and William would go on to have another child, Evan, that same year. Charlie and Evan were raised alongside each other and were great friends. Clara would step into the role of a surrogate mother, often watching and caring for Charlie while Henry was buried in his work and his sadness. William would see Evan as the perfect child, one deserving of his love, and so he would treat him as such. William was happy. He finally felt that void in his heart left by his parents filled with Evan's love. It was around this time that William would develop the idea of the Springlock animatronic. With Henry's guidance, he had learned quite a lot about the animatronics, Henry even going on to say William had a gift. This fed William's ego, which was not a good idea. William had devised the idea that one could wear a suit that was also an animatronic, a hybrid of sorts. In this way, they could walk around like William's old days at Fredbear's, entertaining and laughing right next to the children, but they would be the same characters that were up on stage, not some cloth and fur facsimile. They would seamlessly transition from animatronic to suit with the children none the wiser. The problem was that the complex mechanism required to hold the parts of the suit at the side had a very significant weakness. It seemed that when exposed to moisture, the gears inside the system would slip and thus cause the spring locks to close. If a performer had been inside when that happened, well, the outcome would be severe, likely fatal. Henry would have been sure to have William correct these flaws, but he didn't do a proper examination because of his continued depression. Thus, he overlooked the issue. And with William's novice skill set, he had also overlooked the flaws. And so, William built the animatronics that would be the faces of Fredbear's family diner. Fredbear and Spring Bonnie, resurrected. They both left Chica's Party World, and with William's ownership and Henry's seed investment in skill, they were able to reopen Fredbear's family diner with the newly improved characters. But Henry wouldn't be satisfied with just one restaurant. No, his sights were set much higher. There wouldn't be just one restaurant, no. Fredbear was deserving of a franchise. And so, Henry would start the LLC Fredbear Entertainment. Henry would be CEO, as he had financed the venture, and, though technically below Henry, William would be his partner. Henry would wear the Fredbear costume, while William would return to his role as Spring Bonnie. Though occasionally other employees would don the suits as time went on, William would take on the role whenever he could. He had a close connection to both characters. Fredbear was his family, his history, his legacy. Spring Bonnie was his alone, his other half. Over the next 2 years, the business thrived. Henry and William had created a cutting-edge family dining experience. People were coming from all over the state to see the new animatronics in action. Without Henry to maintain the animatronics and the sudden popularity and competition with Fredbear's, Chica's Party World had to close down. Henry saw an opportunity and was able to buy the IP and the restaurant space for pennies on the dollar. Now that they had ownership of the characters in space, Henry and William got to planning the new mascots that would headline the next restaurant. While the original diner would continue to house Fredbear and Spring Bonnie, the new restaurant would have a different cast. Freddy Fazbear, an updated take on the original Fredbear, would be the singer of a band and leader of the group. Bonnie, a version of Spring Bonnie with the opposite personality, would be added as the bassist and was very laid back. Freddy and Bonnie would have their colors changed from the original gold for merchandising purposes. Chica was already popular as the yellow chicken. As such, Freddy would be made brown and Bonnie a bluish purple. Changing the name of the company to Fazbear Entertainment, it was clear that they were very excited about the new characters. A successful cartoon was made starring the three characters, as well as a fourth who would eventually be brought into the fold, Foxy, a seemingly villainous fox pirate who chases the band around, but ultimately joins them as a friend in the end. During this time, they modified the original animatronic designs from Chica's Party World into the new animatronics that would helm the new restaurant. You see, in order to get the restaurant up and running in a timely manner, and in order to save on costs, Henry would have William disassemble and improve the original animatronics from Chica's Party World. While William was busy building the endoskeletons that would occupy the suits, Henry went about developing a complex computer chip to improve the movements of the animatronics, and to add some more personality. With this new development, Henry was able to give the animatronics a few rudimentary actions that could be carried out independently. For example, if a child waved at Freddy, he could look and wave back. This kind of reactive response was decades ahead of its time. Each character would be built around their personality, as shown in the cartoon, to give that little bit of extra magic. While the business saw success, William's paranoia became more severe. He became short-tempered and angry. He and Clara had another child, a daughter named Elizabeth, and after a bad argument while Elizabeth was still an infant, Clara left William and the state with their daughter, fearing for her safety. She tried to sue for custody of the boys, but William convinced them to choose him over their mother, and so they had split custody. William began to lose control of his anxieties and began taking steps to, in his mind, protect his children. He set up cameras all throughout the house and even some outside in the neighborhood. He built a workshop in the basement, hidden behind a false wall. And for his child Evan, his favorite, the one he would do anything for, he made a Fredbear plushie with a camera and microphone to always keep him monitored. Now he could work and keep track of the children at the same time. And so, while William's personal life was failing, Fazbear Entertainment had become a successful brand. They created iconic characters that children would connect with for decades to come. William had resurrected his family restaurant, and no one could take that from him. And in that, he found his peculiar form of happiness, drenched in pride. Arrogance. And so the future looked bright. But just on the horizon, a spiral of agony was about to unfold. All right, big leap here, so I'm going to explain myself. There's some stuff that I added in here that's pretty significant, but ultimately I think it still gels well with everything to come. This is one of those moments that is heavily informed by the new information that we have gathered from FNAF Ruin. Without going too deep into what we'll touch on towards the end of this series, there's an animatronic in Ruin that we learn is incredibly intelligent, and when using the books as reference, it seems that this was built somewhere in the 80s, and likely by Henry. This, to me, actually helps explain a lot about the possession of the animatronics and beyond. In FNAF 2, which takes place in 1987, we have the toy animatronics, which have facial recognition and more complex actions. This technology of Henry's that I'm talking about helps explain how that could come to be, a further iteration of those same personality chips. Later, in Help Wanted, FNAF 8, we learn that the circuit boards of animatronics can be scanned to download their information into a digital space, a VR game. So, we know that the animatronics must have circuit boards that retain information of some sort so that they can be scanned. Thus, Henry, working on some kind of sophisticated personality chip, actually helps explain this issue, and he would continue to work on upgrading this technology going forward. But the only reason I've even thought of this and brought it into the theory is because of the most recent game's security breach ruin. I had to rewrite this entire thing when that came out. So just know that this is more of a fresh baby theory popped right out of the oven. Shout out to Rye Toast. So I also added in the bit about William and Clara's relationship being so tumultuous, and specifically the assumed affair with Henry. In FNAF's sister location, FNAF 5, there is a cartoon called The Immortal and the Restless, in which a vampire and his wife, Clara, argue over who is the child's father. Though the baby is clearly a vampire and thus his child, he continues to claim the child is not his. Many theorists have taken this to be a parallel to William's relationship with his wife. In my opinion, and this is one that I assume other people have had, but I haven't seen it out there, I think that a false accusation of an affair seems to fit really well with these characters and how The Immortal and the Restless carries out. On top of William's seeming heartlessness, there's a large helping of paranoia, and he has a huge ego, which means he's incredibly insecure. Henry, on the other hand, is an empathetic and gentle man. To see his wife consoled by that man, even though it was platonic in nature, would cause him to panic. But that insecurity remains. And when he learns of Clara's pregnancy, it is immediately a confirmation of his greatest fears, regardless of how valid it may be. This would explain his insistence that Michael isn't his child while still having a striking resemblance to him. And it would explain why he treats Michael so poorly. On top of this, William and his wife having a rocky relationship can actually help clean up some of the messes in the timeline. For example, in one of the mini-games, we see Evan visit Elizabeth's empty room, which a lot of people have interpreted as being Elizabeth being dead. However, in this way, with the fight between William and Clara having Clara leave with Elizabeth, it can simply be that she is away from home with her mother. I'll explain more about that in the second part of this series, but know that the order of events that occur between 1983 and 1994 is highly contested. So, the stage is set. We have the main characters all in play. They have relationships and motivations. There are a lot of things here where I filled in the blanks because we really don't have a lot of concrete information for what goes on pre-1983. For example, we know there were multiple restaurants, that William and Henry had families. We know that Henry and William could both create and maintain animatronics. And we know that Fazbear Entertainment released a cartoon and merchandise and was incredibly successful. Beyond those details, we have very little to go on. We don't know when they were born or how old the children were, other than a rough approximation based on events in the timeline and basically how tall they are. We don't know much about the home life of William and Henry, and especially during this part of the story. We know nothing about the mothers of the children. Nothing. Clara's name is assumed from The Immortal and the Restless. Alice doesn't exist in the games, at least as far as we know, only in the books. We don't know how old William and Henry are, or how and when they learned to work with animatronics. We don't even know if Chica's Party World is real. The only info we have on it is buried in the source code of teaser images Scott Cawthon released in the build-up to FNAF Sister Location, and even then it's just the name of the restaurant. So basically, I'm filling in the space between there because I want to lay the groundwork for these motivations, as I said before. While we know a lot about the tragic events that occur throughout the series, that's about all we really learn. The other stuff is pulled from the books, from the graphic novels, which both vary wildly from the game lore, but also mirror them in many ways, and they are in some way considered canon, but they can't be the same canon. It's a lot. It's a lot. So by studying those other pieces of lore, we are able to create this patchwork of information that can help us really figure out some of those details. So on the one hand, the books are bonkers, and on the other hand, they actually kind of help us learn some things. All right, so with all of that out of the way, we're going to move on from this history of Fredbears. We're all caught up to where we were before, and so, without further ado, let's head to 1984. In the aftermath of Evan's death, William wanted nothing more than to get back to work. He had lost his opportunity to save his child. Now all that mattered was moving forward and trying to hide the pain, even from himself. Clara and Elizabeth stayed, though only due to Clara's insistence. Elizabeth wanted to see her daddy, and after what happened to Evan, she couldn't take that away from her. Clara and William's relationship would not be mended, but they learned to coexist for the sake of the children. Now, this generally worked because William stayed locked away in his workshop. Still, he would rather have been at the restaurant. Henry was horrified by the accident. He shut down the restaurant until they could fully address the problem. Luckily, it had been a private party, so information hadn't leaked to the press and Henry was able to keep it under wraps. He couldn't believe it had happened at their restaurant. How could the spring lock have failed like that? When he went to look at the suit to try and understand what had gone wrong, he saw the battered and broken state it was in. A crowbar laying on the ground next to it. Henry watched the security footage back and saw as William brutally attacked the Fredbear suit. His friend was clearly volatile and in pain. He couldn't be allowed back to work just yet. When William returned to the restaurant, Henry was quick to tell him to remain on leave, not just for the sake of his children, but also because of the incident at the hospital. Henry couldn't have the negative press drawing attention to the restaurant and making the accident more public. When William refused, Henry invoked the power of CEO to force William to stay home. William was taken aback. They were supposed to be friends. William drove home, aimless and infuriated. How could Henry do this to him? While he was in this state, after losing a child, how could Henry demean him in such a way? He knew Henry had always secretly hated him. The way he spoke with Clara, William was certain that they had had an affair. They may be even continuing it now. William would watch through his cameras as Clara told Henry all of their dark secrets, supposedly in the name of helping William. Lies. Henry, who had become worried about another incident occurring, went about designing new characters as animatronics, but one specifically built to prevent these kinds of accidents, and to prevent children from getting into other dangerous situations. The first of these creations would be known to Henry as the Marionette, though within the business it was more commonly referred to as the puppet. The purpose of this puppet was ostensibly to bring prizes to children who won at games. The true purpose was to keep children away from dangerous scenarios, getting too close to the animatronics, heading towards the back room, or leaving the restaurant unattended. The child Henry was most concerned about and would task the puppet with protecting was his daughter, Charlie. But to carry out such a complex task, Henry would have to go about developing a new way for these puppets to move. They couldn't just have pre-programmed movements. They would have to be able to follow, to adapt, to learn. This is when he began developing the Mimic chip. This would change animatronics forever. He knew it. Forget animatronics, this was a breakthrough in robotics. The device worked by allowing the animatronic to watch, record, and recreate actions that it observes. It can then apply those actions to relevant situations that it encounters. Henry would be able to create animatronics that could interact with people on a more complex level than ever before. Not alive, not intelligent per se, but adaptive. For now, he would only test it on the puppets, but if it were successful, then the possibilities would be limitless. Fredbear's Family Diner would reopen in 1984. Henry went about doing everything he could to build up the new franchise and put the old Fredbears behind them, at least for now. Fredbear would have his black hat and bow tie changed to a more friendly purple in order to differentiate him more from the new Freddy Fazbear, who also had a black hat and bow tie. Because Freddy was in the cartoon, it made more sense to just change Fredbear. The tragedy of Evan was too much for everyone to bear, and though there wasn't a lot of press due to Henry's efforts to get ahead of the story, the rumors had spread already among the community. So, for now, they would focus their efforts on the new characters and moving the franchise forward. One thing that Henry made absolutely clear was that at the new restaurant and ever in the franchise going forward, there would never be another Springlock. William continued his obsession with creating newer, more complex machines. In his more fringe studies, he had learned that there may be ways to bring Evan back still. At night, he would sneak into the restaurant donning his old security guard uniform. Henry didn't see a need to change them after they acquired the restaurant, and he could save some costs. William would pore over Henry's blueprints and files. He needed to know everything. Without the diner, William was crushed and confused. What could he do? William would wander the halls of the restaurant. His restaurant. The original gold-colored bear and bunny lay motionless on the floor of the back room. Like two lifeless corpses rested against the wall, William's legacy stared at him from the grave. He gazed at Fredbear, the silver eyes shining back at him. Spring Bonnie had dark pits, somehow more lifeless than the murderous bear. The bunny was a part of him after all. It was empty without him. When he would put on the suit, he became someone else. He decided to wear it, though in his state it felt more like Spring Bonnie was the one donning a suit. Through those eyes, hidden behind the smiling face, William felt something change. His rage, his sadness. It became something else. Something playful? There was still a malice there, but now it was more focused. Henry had taken away everything from him. It was Henry who bought out his company, taking control of William's legacy. Henry who built the animatronics, leading to the death of William's son, his only son, as far as William was concerned. Henry needed to pay. But how could he hurt Henry? How could he shame him? This would become William's primary goal. Hurting Henry. One night, Henry was working at Freddy's, and it brought Charlie along with him. He would be quite distracted while working, having to manage both William's and his job. He was thankful for his creation, the Marionette, knowing that it would track Charlie and keep her out of trouble. The puppet would spend much of its time inside of a large gift box near the entrance. If Charlie strayed too close to the exit or to the back room, the puppet would emerge and walk Charlie back to someplace safe. Charlie had taken a liking to the puppet and would sometimes sneak towards the back room to summon her puppet friend so that they could spend time together. Henry noticed that the puppet started to learn how to hug and even learned a soundless imitation of laughter where it would cock back its head. The effects of the mimic chip seemed to be far more effective than Henry had expected. On that night, William was drunkenly driving to confront Henry. He didn't even know what he wanted to do, but on that night, he reached his tipping point. A large knife lay in the passenger seat next to him, though he insisted to himself he wouldn't use it. Back at the restaurant, a child's birthday party was underway. Charlie wandered towards the front door. Charlie knew that if she went to head outside, the puppet would come to play with her. Normally, the puppet would emerge to stop her, but this time it was unable to get out of its giant gift box, as a parent had chosen to place their pile of children's gifts on top of it. When she reached for the door and her friend didn't appear, she kept going until she was outside. She smiled and laughed as she stepped out into the rainy night. She turned to see the door shut behind her and a mischievous child locking it. Her friend was nowhere. Her daddy was nowhere. She began pounding on the door, but no one would see or hear her. Just then, as if by fate, William arrived at the restaurant. As he angrily stared out his window approaching the parking lot, he saw Charlie outside the door, clearly in distress. His instincts kicked in and he went to help her. But what about Henry? He thought to himself. He remembered how much he wanted to hurt Henry. He wanted him to feel how he did, to feel the loss of a child. A menacing smile came over his face as he heard the bunny's voice in his head. There was one way that Henry could feel that pain. William stepped out of his car, walking over to Charlie. "Charlotte, are you okay?" he asked. Charlie quickly turned and ran to her Uncle William. She cried and pleaded to him to let her back in. "Don't worry, Charlie, let's go in together. But, I can't seem to open this door. It's locked." "I know. Let's go around to the other door, the secret door," he said. Charlie seemed to calm down a bit as William led her into the alley. And then, he pulled his knife from his pocket. He quickly stabbed the child. She fell to the ground, limp. William stood in the rain, looking down at the lifeless child, just like his. William felt nothing. Not better, no, his vengeance hadn't been sated. But he also felt no remorse. He felt justified. From that day forward, William and death would have an entirely different relationship. It turns out William had been hiding from his true self. He only let it out in small moments, but now he truly saw himself, and he knew what he had to do. The puppet eventually escaped the giant gift box and swiftly exited the restaurant into the rain. Its circuitry popped and hissed as it made its way towards Charlie. First it walked, then it crawled, slowly deteriorating as it made its way down the alleyway. It approached Charlie's lifeless body and laid on top of her, hugging her. The puppet short-circuited moments after. And yet, the puppet rose again, with more than itself inside. The puppet was confused. Or was it Charlie? It was both the puppet and Charlie. Charlie saw her lifeless body on the ground through the puppet's eyes and began to scream and cry, though no sound escaped the mask. She had no voice. As she cried, fluid poured from the eyes, leaving large tear stains streaming down the mask. Eventually, the puppet got up and looked around. All it really knew was the restaurant, and so it crawled up the wall into a nearby vent, making its way into the back of the building. It would hide away in the shadows as it watched and listened. William was dangerous, and the puppet's job was to protect children. Henry was devastated by the loss of Charlie, the only person he had left. He had no choice but to close down the restaurant. He couldn't manage it any longer, and now there were too many awful memories from that place. Not only had Evan died in their restaurant, but now Charlie, murdered in the alleyway. His creation had failed, and so he had failed. And so Fredbear's Family Diner would close its doors once again. Okay, FNAF fans, thank you for waiting so long on my explanation. So, let's talk about the timeline, and what happens in the games that informs my part of the narrative. In a series of minigames throughout the games, we learn the stories of several children. Evan gets the most attention, following him around and making it clear he's an ostracized child. We learn about the talking Fredbear plush. We see the bite of 83 in pretty clear detail, so that's well supported. We also see two different angles of Charlie's death, one focused on Charlie and one focused on the puppet. And we know that William is the one who killed Charlie. One of the simplest set of gaps that I filled in here mostly has to do with motivating William and showing Henry's form of neglect as he focused on the business over his child. And everything related to Clara and the family aftermath of Evan's death, we didn't see any of that, and this greatly informs William's motivations and trajectory towards the murders he commits. The most significant thing, though, that I added was how I explained the puppet's thinking, and essentially the first explained haunting. For children who die in or near animatronics, their spirits can become attached to them. And while people really focus on the how with things like remnant and agony, which we may get into later, I think it's better to not be fully explained. However, I did add the concept of the puppet's personality influencing the way that Charlie controls it, and it's not something I've really seen people discuss before. However, this is not a theory without evidence. A big piece of evidence that sent me in this direction was a character that we will go into in more depth in the next video, named Baby. Without revealing too much, there is a recording of the animatronic Baby describing how she can still hear her sometimes, referring to the girl who possesses her in the third person. To me, this suggests that it's not just the spirit working through the animatronics, but something more. The combination of the personality chips conflicting with the spirit creates a new sort of consciousness all into itself. In psychology, we call the human consciousness reified. Yes, I have a master's in psychology, and no, I don't use it for anything. I legitimately can't say that without laughing. In psychology, we call the human consciousness reified. This means that it's something abstract, something that isn't just matter. Take away a part of the brain, and yet you still remain. The abstract you. The spirit, the soul, energy, consciousness, whatever you might call it. But the personality can change when you take part of the brain out. The behavior can change. The limitations can change. I see these personality chips as the opposite. It's almost like you're putting extra brain in with the original. It's still you, but something more. Does that make sense? Basically, ghosts have to deal with the limitations of what they possess. The only reason I really think this is important is, as I said earlier, with the chips. With the age and personalities of the children alone, the behavior of the animatronics is bizarre. But with a conflict between the spirit and the machine, suddenly it can explain the shocking and confusing behavior. I just never understood how the spirits of children all became so violent. Now, in the earlier games, you can explain this as wearing the security guard uniform means they see you as if you are Afton, and thus they're attacking you for killing them. They could just as easily try to get help from people, and we'd hear about this. This would be terrifying, though in a different way. They also don't flee from people as if they're scared, when you would think a child who had died in such a way might be afraid of people. Instead, in the game, we see nearly every animatronic respond to other people violently. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll talk more about these details in the next episode. Now, if you have a theory on that, please let me know in the comments below. Honestly, if you have a theory on any of these things that I've said and you disagree, please let me know in the comments below, because I'm always wanting to refine my theories. I want to change it if things don't make sense, so do that. And with that, I will call an end to this first episode in the series. In the next episode, we will see the schism between William and Henry grow larger. the creation of Afton Robotics, the missing children's incident, and probably the events of Five Nights at Freddy's 1 and 2. A lot happens there, and I'm really excited to get to share it with y'all. I'm not exactly sure how long this series will be, somewhere between 3 to 5 episodes probably. I'll try and have the next episode out within the next month, though it might be a little longer than that because this took me forever, and we have a lot of stuff going on in Stumpt very soon. When I finish the whole series, I'll throw together a complete video with all of the episodes for those of you who, like me, like a nice long 4-hour video containing the entire timeline. Make sure to subscribe so you can see the next episode as soon as it goes live, and I'll make a community post and a premiere to remind people, so if you're not into my gaming content, don't worry, you'll know when the new one comes out. I'll just be straight up honest, I would love to see the sub number go up, so if you subscribe, but only come back for the FNAF videos, I don't have any issue with that, but I would appreciate the heck out of you hitting that sub button regardless. It helps my videos get seen by more people, and it'll make me feel like I reached a lot more of y'all than my usual audience. You'll notice I have a lot of gameplay on this channel, because that's been my main bread and butter, so check some of that out if you feel so inclined, and check out my main gig over at STUMPTGAMERS where we play lots of co-op games. I want to give a special shout out to so many fantastic creators whose names are somewhere on the screen, with links to their YouTube pages in the description. They are all fantastic, and I could not have made this video without them. And with that, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. I have been Price, and I will see y'all next time.
Is that the bite of 87?